So today we continue our discussion of Robert Enright's book, Forgiveness is a Choice. And today we begin looking at the process of forgiveness. It's that part 2, that section of Enright's book where he goes through the 4 phases of forgiveness. And in these presentations, I'm going to just focus on giving an overview of those 4 phases. That said, Enright's book, if you read the book, is full of really helpful advice on how to work through the forgiveness process. For example, he suggests keeping a journal and has some really good advice for how to keep a journal as you work through each of the questions in the 4 phases. He also suggests getting a forgiveness companion, which is a really good idea, someone to talk to and check in with and talk about how the forgiveness process is going for you. He also has lots of examples, lots of stories of people who are working through the forgiveness process to illustrate the point he's trying to make. And he's a psychologist, after all, and he provides a lot of good sound and sensitive psychological advice for someone who's working through the process of forgiveness. So if you wanted to kind of really work through that in a step-by-step process through those 4 phases, reading the book would be really helpful. It adds a whole lot to it. But for our purposes, I'm just going to try to summarize those 4 phases. I want us to have a good understanding of those 4 phases so we can talk about what he means by forgiveness in our class, especially because we're going to be talking about other folks. But again, if you really wanted to work through more deeply with his book, I suggest you read his book. So, to begin, I just want to give just a bare bones overview of the 4 phases, and then I'll go back and go through each one in more depth, just so we kind of know where we're going, right? So the first phase in the process of forgiveness is uncovering your anger. Uncovering our anger, right? So to forgive, according to Enright, we must be willing to examine honestly how much anger we have as a result of someone's wrongdoing towards us. And he gives a lot of questions in ways in which we can try to think about how much anger we have because of a wrongdoing against us. Phase 2 is deciding to forgive, right? Forgiveness is a choice. That's the title of his book, right? And it requires, at some point, if we are going to forgive, to make a decision and make a commitment to work through the forgiveness process. So it's a choice that we can make or not make. Phase 3 is working on forgiveness. Right, we have to make a choice, but that doesn't end. It's really the beginning of the forgiveness process. We need to take concrete actions to make forgiveness real. And there will be a number of things that Enright gives us, gives people to work on as we work on making that commitment real in our lives. And phase 4 is discovery and release from emotional pain, right? So the forgiveness process eventually leads to this freeing of ourselves from that prison cell that he says that has the walls of unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment, and anger, right? So those are the 4 phases in really brief outline, and now I'll turn to each of these phases in turn in a little more detail. So the first phase is acknowledging our anger. So this first phase is all about sort of uncovering our anger, whether we're aware of it or not, right? So before we can forgive, according to Enright, we have to understand the nature and the depth of our anger. So the first step is to examine as honestly as possible the amount of anger that we harbor as a result of wrongdoing against us. And so in order to do this, in order to acknowledge, uncover, and honestly reckon with our anger, Enright guides us through a series of questions to help us acknowledge that. So he begins by asking, how have we avoided dealing with our anger? And so here he kind of just goes through a list of common defense mechanisms, right? Things that psychologists tell us that we use to shield ourselves from some really tough feelings. And I would note that, and he also notes that defense mechanisms are, it's not that they're entirely negative, they protect us, right? So we use them to cope, but maybe they're not the most healthy way to cope, right? So the first phase in acknowledging our anger is kind of to look honestly at some of the defense mechanisms we may be using. We might recognize that, they've helped us cope, but maybe they're not really helping us cope as well as we can, as we seek psychological well-being. So the first common defense mechanism that he mentions is denial. Denial, where we basically convince ourselves that nothing bad really happened, right? We just deny it, right? And so, denial temporarily kind of shields us from shock and despair. So it has a function there, right? So maybe it's helpful, perhaps, in the short term. But in the long term, denying that something hurtful has happened to us really isn't the healthiest way to deal with something that hurts us and maybe causing us anger. And from a forgiveness standpoint, it may end up, if you deny that you were hurt, you might end up in that condoning of the behavior rather than saying, that was wrong and it really hurt and it shouldn't have happened. So before we can forgive, we really have to recognize that, and denial doesn't allow us to recognize the depth of our hurt and our anger. So a second defense mechanism that he mentions is suppression. Right, this is basically, when we push thoughts about the wrongdoing from our consciousness, right? So we deal with, injustice done to us and the pain that we feel by trying to distract ourselves, right? I just don't have time to talk about that right now. I've got, these 4 projects I have to do. Can we sit down and talk about what's going on? No, I gotta make dinner. I gotta pick the kids up. I gotta do all these kinds of things. So, it's, at some level we're aware of it, but we sort of suppress it and we push it aside and we never really deal with it. And this way of coping with anger, it prevents our healing. So at some point we have to sit down and confront, say, okay, I'm just sit with it and see it. So suppression may be a sign we're angry, but we're not really dealing with it in a healthy way. The third common defense mechanism that he mentions is repression. And so in repression, according to Enright, we don't just distract ourselves, we actually push out of consciousness all memory of the wrongdoing. I would say, this is a complicated and debated phenomenon, and I don't want to get sidetracked on that. Suffice it to say that Enright says that sometimes when something really traumatic happens to us, some people deal with this by repressing all memory of it, and then it might get triggered by place or people or something like that, but it's down there somewhere. So that's another way, we deal with moral harm, and the anger is to completely repress things. So, like I said, debated topic. I don't want to get sidetracked. So, the fourth one that he mentions is displacement, right, where we transfer the angry feelings that we have towards the person who hurt us to someone else who may be an innocent bystander, right? He gives lots of examples, and those are really useful. I think he gives an example that a man who as a child was hurt by a controlling mother, well, the way he deals with that anger is every time, his wife makes a, innocent suggestion, he, blows up and accuses her of trying to control him. What? What's going on? He's really not dealing with his anger towards his mother. He's taking it out, or transferring it, I should say, to his wife, who's in a certain sense an innocent bystander. And so if you're doing these things, you might want to think, okay, I really haven't dealt with my anger terribly well. A fifth type of common defense mechanism is regression. Here we engage in behavior that may be understandable in a child, but is inappropriate in an adult, right? It's for an adult, it's a really unhealthy way of dealing with anger, right? So adults who have temper tantrums are probably not dealing with their anger and their hurt in the best ways, right? I don't know if you ordered vanilla ice cream and you got chocolate and you just blow up at the server. You're like, what's going on, man? What's this about? Well, if you're constantly having temper tantrums over these kinds of things, this is regression. Maybe we need to spend a little time looking at our hurt and our anger. It's not the most mature way to deal with things, perhaps. And another common defense mechanism that Enright names is identification with the aggressor. And so here, the victim ends up imitating the behavior of the wrongdoer, right? We see this in really abusive situations where the person who is abused becomes an abuser, or the child who is beaten becomes a bully, right? So that's one way to deal with anger, by imitating the behavior of the wrongdoer, but probably not the best, right? So the point in all these kinds of looking at these defense mechanisms is Enright saying, have we really honestly faced our anger, right? And at this point, he's really not asking you to do much with it except for to look at it or to acknowledge it, right? And so, the reason he goes through these common defense mechanisms is just to sort of say, okay, I'm doing that, and I may be doing those things to avoid honestly facing the harm that was done to me and the anger I feel about that. So at this point in the forgiveness process, you don't have to do anything to change those things yet. He just wants us to see it for what it is, right? And that's an important kind of step in the process, right? So defense mechanisms may have, helped us cope to a certain extent, but we might want to look at that a little more closely to see if we have really honestly grappled with the harm that was done to us and the way the anger is continuing to harm us. So he also asks some further questions that may be part of why or how we don't face up to the reality of the harm that is done to us in our anger. One is to ask, are we afraid to expose really the depths of our shame and guilt? So he begins with shame. So perhaps we're not looking at our anger and hurt because of shame, right? And he says shame is the fear we have of what others will think of us when they find out what happened to us, even though we were the victim, right? Will they think we're weak or we're damaged or maybe somehow to blame, right? So shame may lead us not to really kind of look at that because we're afraid of what people will think. So he suggests if we're kind of to face our anger, perhaps we're going to need to find a safe place where we can expose our shame to the light of day. It could be with a trusted friend, but a therapist or clergy person. Could be someone who will safely listen and not judge and hear what's going on, your hurt and your anger. He also discusses guilt, and it's a little complicated, I think, and for me, I'm a little confused, but for how we kind of fail to acknowledge our anger. So what is guilt? So he distinguishes between real guilt and false guilt. So, but it's how guilt is how we feel about ourselves when we realize that we have violated our own standards of right and wrong. And I think so the real guilt that might be getting in our way, at least if I understand Enright correctly, might be like, well, if I've been morally harmed and I'm really angry about it, I may have responded towards the person who harmed me in some ways that really don't live up to my own standards. I might have, cussed him out or ran him down as a person or denigrated him when I think my own standards think, well, two wrongs don't make a right, or, the person who harmed me was wrong, but I don't have the right to treat anybody the way I treated that person I was hurt. So I think that real guilt, he says, might be causing us not to kind of look deeply at the level of our hurt and anger. That may be the case. And then there's also this false sense of guilt, which I think is the more problematic sense, that in which oftentimes in situations of abuse, people who are being harmed, morally harmed, they didn't do anything to deserve this at all, but nonetheless they somehow feel like maybe it was their fault. And that's a false sense of guilt, which may not help us when we try to look at, that was really wrong. I didn't deserve it. I didn't do anything to deserve it. It should not have happened. And that was wrong. So sometimes false guilt can get in the way of our seeing the depth of our hurt and our anger. He also asks the question, so has anger affected our health, right? Anger drains our energy and in some cases can make us ill, right? He also asks things like, have we become obsessed with the injury and the offender, right? For some people, they just can't help replaying the injury or getting the offender out of their mind, right? They fixate on the injury or the person night and day, and they sort of just go over and over and over it. Even when they feel like they don't want to, it just this loop keeps going on. Well, that's a sign that maybe we haven't dealt with our anger and our hurt as well. He also says, do we end up comparing our situation with that of the offender, right? If the offender, somebody who morally harmed us, is prospering somehow, and we have suffered, that can be a source of real anger. And, if the person kind of continues to prosper and we continue to suffer as a result of this wrongdoing, it creates new reasons to be angry. Like, why? How is this working out for him? And I still have to deal with this. So it can kind of keep going or spiraling, I suppose. So that's another way in which we need to kind of confront our anger. He also asks, has the injury caused a permanent change in our lives, right? So sometimes the harm is so bad that it disables us in some way. And in these cases, Enright thinks the forgiveness will be difficult, maybe more difficult, right? So perhaps before we can forgive, if we have been harmed so badly that it permanently changes our life, we might have to go through a process of grieving over the loss of a particular way of life because of this permanent change before we can, even begin the forgiveness process and acknowledging our anger and our hurt, right? He also asks, has the injury changed our worldview, right? When we're harmed, when wrongdoing is done to us, it can change the way we view our world, right? Optimistic and trusting people can become distrusting and cynical. So that's another, layer to this, that the anger that we might have to kind of uncover and the harm we might have to deal with, that is, it changed me. It changed the way I look at the world. And that makes me angry because I used to be very optimistic and trusting and joyful, and now I can't anymore because of this. Anger, hurt, right? So all this phase one process is to help us to acknowledge our anger, right? And for Enright, emotional pain may be a motivator for seeking solutions to our problems, right? Is anger present when we think about the wrongdoing that happened to us? Is it still an intense anger after months and years after the wrongdoing has happened? Is our anger making us sick and tired? Do we continually think about the offense and the offender? And has the offense changed our lives for the worse? If we're working through questions like this and the questions about acknowledging our anger and recognizing the extent and the harm that has been done to us, and we kind of feel like, I want to be released from that emotional pain and all the ways in which it's stifling me and my life and my desires and the person I think I should be, the person God thinks I should be, etc. Then I think he thinks, well, maybe we're ready to take the next step and consider deciding to forgive. Phase two of the forgiveness process is committing to forgive or deciding to forgive. So he breaks this down in basically 3 steps within phase two. First, we decide that what we have been doing about our anger and our hurt isn't working anymore. So he gives a lot of examples, but he basically says, ask yourself honestly, is what you are doing working for you? So if I'm regressing and throwing temper tantrums, maybe that's not working for me. Are you happy? Are you at peace? Are you able to trust? Are you optimistic about the future? If not, if the answer is no to these questions, maybe it's time, he thinks, to try a different course. Right? If revenge and anger and bitterness and maybe some of our defense mechanisms are not making us happy, maybe it's time to try something else, right? So after we sort of decide if things aren't going so well, the second step is to be willing to begin the forgiveness process. Here, the emphasis is on willing, right? Being willing. So if we recognize that our failed strategies are not working, then we can look to the future and consider maybe a different way. And if we start considering forgiveness, we're considering that forgiveness will take us down one path, and not another, right? So we need to consider these things. And so, and there's no guarantees, he said, you know. He thinks forgiveness interventions are pretty successful and can really bring a lot of healing, and but there's no guarantees, right? But there is hope if you go down this road of forgiveness, that it will make a very positive change in your life. So at this step, in this phase, we're just taking a pause, right? We need to pause and ask ourselves, am I willing to go down this path of forgiveness, right? It's not making a decision yet. We're considering it, right? It is simply and intentionally asking if I'm willing to consider forgiveness as a serious possibility. And in his exercise here, for your journal exercise, if you were doing that, Enright asks you to write down kind of as precisely as possible your definition of forgiveness. He wants you to kind of begin with his and then tweak it and those kinds of things. But basically, you write down what you mean. What is forgiveness? What is it not? What is it I'm considering doing as specifically as you can, right? So as we're kind of at this phase of considering whether we're willing to begin the forgiveness process, to make a good consideration, we have to be pretty clear about what we mean by forgiveness. What is it? What is not? Okay. And then the third step, if we're continuing down this forgiveness process in phase 3, is deciding to forgive, right? Forgiveness is a choice. Enright's title, right? We can choose to do this. He also says we can choose to stop the process anytime, and we can choose to begin again if we've stopped the process. It is a choice, it remains a choice all along, but we do have to decide to forgive, right? And so at this point, if we do make a decision, we realize that the decision is, it's not complete. It's not the complete process, it's really making a good beginning of the process. It's just at the beginning, right? We commit to a process of forgiveness. We are open and receptive to taking the time to allow the forgiveness process to work itself out. So it requires patience and perseverance. It probably involves trust that something will happen. Maybe not us manipulating things, but rather allowing things to happen through this forgiveness process. And so Enright says that's basically where we are at the end of phase 2, right? We're not making, a decision to add right now anything positive, like looking at the offender and offering a gift of compassion, benevolence, and love. That's down the road, right? Right now, we're just making the decision to begin the forgiveness process. That does mean we forswear vengeance at this point, right? And that's not only like, physical vengeance. I'm going to go out and, physically retaliate, but it also is, I'm not going to maliciously slander this person, try to undermine them, do all the things that are really vengeful acts. We forswear that, and we make a commitment that we are willing to begin this forgiveness process. And that's it. That's where we are at this stage. Offering that gift of compassion, benevolence, and love, that's further down the road. That's in another phase. So that is phase 2, committing to forgive or deciding to forgive. So now we move to phase 3 of the forgiveness process, which is working on forgiveness. And in phase 3, we're engaged in a shift of focus, right? Because the first 2 phases of the forgiveness process were focused on ourselves. Well, it was focused on the person who was the victim of wrongdoing, and uncovering our anger and acknowledging our anger and the ways in which we've been hurt by wrongdoing. But in phase 3, we shift the focus away from ourselves and on to the person who harmed us. And we do this in an exercise to try to understand the person who harmed us better, and to try to gain a larger perspective on the person who harmed us and the wrongdoing itself. So it should be noted, though, and Enright repeats this throughout the section, that we work on understanding the offender not to excuse or to condone the offense, right? The offense remains wrong. It was wrong, it is wrong, it always will be wrong. But as we move through this forgiveness process, it is important to try to understand the offender in a larger perspective if we are eventually going to move towards offering that gift of compassion, benevolence, and love. So in this phase, we try to begin to see the offender with new eyes, okay? So Enright encourages us in this phase to engage in an exercise of writing or telling the story of the person who harmed us, to try to place them and the wrongdoing in this larger narrative of this person's life. Because I think the wisdom here is when we're hurt by someone, we can limit our focus on the harm they did to us and them doing that harm, and then we're locked into this understanding of them as simply this evildoer who did this thing to us. And if we are to move through this forgiveness process, Enright wants us to sort of widen the focus so that we see that in the perspective of a narrative of this person's life, and that may help us move towards forgiveness. So to do this, Enright asks us to answer 5 questions, and I'll just briefly note those, and you can probably fill in a lot of the details as well. So the first question Enright would like us to ask ourselves and maybe to write about is, what was life like for the offender growing up? So here we may know the person, or we may try to imagine a bit what it was like for this person as a child and in an adolescent, right? Did the person who hurt us experience hurt or neglect or pain or struggle in their childhood or their adolescence that would help us understand a bit better the person they have become, right? Again, this doesn't excuse or condone their behavior, but Enright gives examples of a person who grew up during the Depression, who then behaved badly, but you can sort of see why her family system was like it was, and maybe why she grew up to be the person she was when she did that wrong thing. Or the person who grew up in the family of an alcoholic, and it was abusive, and then you see how they reacted to that and maybe grew into the person they became. Or maybe the person was in a family system that kept secrets or lied and put up this false front, and then you understand a little better why this person who lied to you did this, because they come from this kind of broken family background that affected them as a child and as adolescents. Again, not to excuse their behavior, but to understand them in a larger perspective. So, the second question is, at the time of the offense, what was life like for the person? Right? So here we try to imagine or understand that, at the time the person harmed me, were they under maybe considerable stress? Were they acting out of fear? What were the circumstances of this person's life when they did this wrong thing to me? Again, it doesn't excuse this bad behavior, but it helps place it in a wider context. And I think he gives the example of someone whose superior at work treated them wrongly, but he tried to understand, all the pressures that this person was under at that time, and his fear and his vulnerability that caused him to act, not caused him, but contributed to the context in which he made a wrong action towards this person. It doesn't excuse it, but it helps place it in this larger context of this person's life, that, he was vulnerable at this time, and he was stressed, and he was fearful. Not to excuse, but to understand. Okay, 3, the third question is, are you able to tell the story of your relationship with this person in a broader sense than the offense itself? So this would have to be a case in which the person who harmed us has some history with us. And so Enright asks if you can kind of go through, how long have you known this person? And can you think of maybe some times that were good in your relationship with this person? And maybe can you name a few times when this person demonstrated good character or good judgment? Again, this isn't to whitewash what the person has done, but to place the person and the offense in this larger narrative of a life. And you say, this is at least a person with some complexity to them. There's some good as well as some bad choices. So it helps to see the person more realistically, right? They're not simply an evildoer. There were times in which he or she demonstrated good character. Okay. 4th, the question is, what is the person like in a global perspective? Here he uses examples of maybe we didn't really have a relationship with the person who harmed us. And so it's very difficult to kind of come up with a backstory or understanding of what they were like in terms of their past relationship with us, and maybe even knowing something about their childhood. But here it may be helpful to try to find ways in which we can understand the person who has harmed us as a member of the human community, right? Can we see them at least as belonging to the human race, people who deserve, a place to live and air to breathe like anyone else. So can we see the offender not just as an evildoer, but as a fellow human being who deserves respect and to be treated with dignity simply because they are human and they share a common humanity with us. And the 5th question that Enright asks us to consider is, what is the person like as you take a cosmic perspective? Here he says this is a question that's probably best answered by religious people. He says, well, if you don't have a religious perspective, you might not answer this one, but in any event, for us here, it makes a lot of sense, I suppose. So how do we make sense of this person in light of our religious convictions, right? How do we understand the nature of God, and how does God see this person? And what do we know about or at least how do we think about redemption in our religious tradition? And what does that say about this person? And so we begin to see maybe this person as someone who's created in the image and likeness of God, someone for whom Christ poured out his life so that they might be redeemed. So he quotes Martin Luther King as an example, Martin Luther King Jr. as an example, who said of people who perpetrate harm, "We love people not because we like them, we love them because God loves them." And he says, at this level, we love the person who does an evil deed, although we hate the deed that the person does. So this cosmic perspective really widens the way in which we understand the narrative of this person's life. So in this beginning of phase 3, as we do the work of forgiveness, we focus on the offender, trying to gain perspective as we try to understand them in the larger narrative of their life. Not to condone or to excuse their behavior, but to see them with new eyes as we try to work through this process of forgiveness and eventually maybe offer a gift of compassion, benevolence, and love. So our next step in phase 3 is to examine the feelings that may have emerged or may emerge as we see the offender in a new light, right? We have been in phase 3 trying to work towards understanding the person in a wider perspective. And as we've done so, perhaps new feelings are emerging about that person, the offender. Enright says these new positive feelings may take time, and we shouldn't try to rush or force the process. Rather, we should allow the forgiveness process to unfold. And as it unfolds, at this phase, at this point, we are working towards compassion. And Enright says working towards empathy and compassion is important because non-feeling, really having neutral emotions towards a person, is not a healing emotion, according to Enright, right? So just kind of having no feeling whatsoever is not a healing emotion. So what are some of those healing emotions? Empathy. Empathy happens when we feel as others feel, right? We are sad when they are sad. We are happy when they are happy. Another healing positive emotion is sympathy, right? And sympathy is when we feel for another, right? We see someone who is angry and we feel sorry for them. And compassion may develop over time. Compassion for the offender may develop over time, right? Compassion means to suffer with another person. And so as we seek to understand the offender, new positive feelings may emerge. Positive feelings of empathy, sympathy, and compassion. So the next part of phase 3, where we work on forgiveness, is we focus on the pain that we have experienced, right? And so as Enright has shown us or has told us, when it comes to pain, we can't deny it and expect it to go away. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. And he also says we know all too well the way that pain multiplies and grows, often by being passed on from parents to children and from one generation to the next. And it spreads. And we also know that pain can lead to self-destructive behavior. So, Enright says, well, if we are going to work on forgiveness, if we are to forgive, we need to learn to deal constructively with our pain, right? And many people are motivated to do this because they don't want to perpetuate the passing on of pain to their children or to their friends. They want to break that cycle of pain. So what do? According to Enright, we learn to accept our pain. We learn to accept our pain. So we need to acknowledge our pain. We need to grieve all the losses that the pain has caused us. And we need to allow ourselves to weep, in fact, and cry over the pain. And as Enright says, when we accept the pain, then we are free and we can begin to heal. So as we go through this forgiveness process, it is important that we learn to deal constructively with our pain, and for Enright, that means we accept our pain. And the final aspect of phase 3, working on forgiveness, is the giving of a gift to the offender. And as Enright says, by giving a gift to the offender, we break the power that that person has over us. Giving a gift flows, as he says, from our transformed feelings toward the offender. We, through the forgiving process, have allowed to emerge positive feelings towards the offender, and the giving of the gift flows from that. So Enright says the appropriate gift for you or anyone who has been offended to give will be unique to that person's situation and circumstances. But he gives a number of examples because he loves personal stories, which are helpful, right? So one person wrote a birthday card. Another person visited the offending person who was their parent, who was in hospital, right? Another person reached out to the offender to offer an expression of thanks for the good things that that person had done. You know, aside from the harm, there are other good things, and he said, I wanted to thank you for the good things that you have done. Some, he said, may take flowers to the graveside of a person who offended them, who has passed away, right? So each of our situations are unique, so the gift that we will give will be unique. But this giving of a gift, to an offender is the final part of phase 3, working on forgiveness.